Hi, friends. Lisa Greenwood here, welcoming you to a unique season of Igniting Imagination. We're handing over the host role to our friends Shannon Hopkins and Mark Elsdon from Rooted Good. They are experts in how churches are thinking about their property. Everywhere we go, leaders are talking about new ways to leverage the church's property for missional purposes. During this series of episodes, Shannon and Mark will connect us with guests who give incredible insights about how church property can serve the neighborhood, how to move through this conversation about church property with your congregation, the theology undergirding how we can use church property, ideas for reimagining church property beyond housing, and so much more. You'll hear from theologians, pastors, nonprofit leaders, religious news writers. These conversations are thoughtful, deep, practical, and will surely be a great resource for the conversations you may be having in your context right now. We're grateful for Mark and Shannon and the whole team at Rooted Good for this collaboration and their important work around church property for such a time as this. As always, if these episodes are meaningful to you, share with colleagues and friends and leave us a review. Thanks for listening. And now, here are Shannon and Mark.
Hi, I'm Shannon Hopkins, and I'm back with you this season of Igniting Imagination with my co-host, Mark Elsdon. We are so excited about this season, and our theme is Properties with New Purpose. As we've been working with churches across America, there are a common set of questions we keep being asked. Things like, what about rural churches? What about things other than housing? And what about churches where members don't want things to change? Those are just a few of the questions we keep being asked. And while there are many questions surrounding this work, this season is full of amazing stories of churches that are rising to this moment. Across this whole season, we're seeing stories of perseverance and passion, creativity and courage, renewal and rebirth. We want to introduce you to the pastors and leaders that are stepping out and showing us a new way. Their work is helping to lay a path into a new and good future for the church and for the world.
Our question for this episode is, what brought us here? How did we get to this point where there was so much talk about the repurposing of church buildings and land and the future economic models of the church in America? Our guest today is Bob Smietana. Bob is a national reporter for Religion News Service, and he's based near Chicago. I'm particularly excited to talk to Bob because I've known him for a number of years now. He is the author of Reorganized Religion, The Reshaping of the American Church and Why It Matters. Bob is an award-winning religion reporter and editor who has spent 2 decades producing breaking news, data journalism, investigative reporting, profiles, and features for magazines, newspapers, and so on. Most notably, he has served as religion news writer at the Tennessean and contributed to Sojourners, USA Today, and the Washington Post. He's best known for his coverage of evangelical Christianity, end-time cat worshippers, yes, that is a thing, and the human side of religion. We're really excited to talk to Bob today about how did we get here and what is the state of the American church today.
Hi, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Shannon. Hi. It's great to be here.
As you know, in this podcast this season, we're talking about this moment in the life of the church that is changing, and specifically about the opportunity and challenges that the church is facing as it relates to building and land. Your recent book, Reorganized Religion, explores the changing landscape in the United States. I'd just love to explore how we got here. Why is there so much extra church space, buildings, lands, and space within buildings? Why is this the conversation we're having at the moment about churches selling and needing to change? How'd we get here?
It's a number of complex reasons. We're at the end of a church-going boom. So from the 50s to the 80s, we had a boom of people going to church building projects, and that's ended. And people stopped going to church. One, they don't think they have to go to church anymore. Two, they have lost faith in institutions of all kinds. So your church is just one more thing they don't belong to. We've also had massive demographic shifts so that people are going to different kinds of congregations. So the churches that were especially mostly white, because up until the 1960s, the country was mostly white, mostly Christian. After the end of after immigration laws changed, the country became more diverse, and so as the country became more diverse, people started to go into different places. And then we've had this kind of failure of churches as well, that people who've had the following of pastors. The other big thing is what's called the Walmart effect, or the consolidation of believers. So if you go to church, so the average congregation in America used to be about 137 people in the year 2000. Now it's 65 people. But the average person who goes to a worship service goes to a worship service of 300 or 400 people. So you have a lot of people in big churches. So the funny thing is, many people are unaware of what's going on, because when they go to church, they're in a great big church and everybody's there and filled with people. And then they think this is what it's like everywhere, when actually it's not. So it's a whole host of factors.
So you're saying that there's some people, the people that are going to church, they're not really noticing this very much, because many of them are going to churches that are actually quite large. And then the people that are noticing it, they don't really care because they're not going anyways, and they're not involved at all, and they're just absent from it. And
or they're in those little churches and they're seeing it. But I do think this is a bigger picture. But one reason why there's all this unease in American culture about the place of Christianity, I think, is that if you go to church and there's a lot of people there and everyone is like you and they're all Christian, and then you go out in the world and it's not like that, you think, wait, how is that possible? There's all these churches. They must all be like mine, and they're not. And then you have just a lot of little churches where they've seen people leave and they have not figured out how to keep going or what to do next. So they're in a long, slow decline. It's two things going on at the same time. So there's the shrinking church. So it's where we're a world where America's a country filled with like mega churches and micro churches. And the micro churches are everywhere. They're all small. And so when you think of the average size church, it's really 60 people. So if you go to church with 60 people, you are the right smack dab in the average.
Yeah, in our area, in our presbytery, I'm a Presbyterian minister, we actually have created a new category, literally micro churches. We've added that category. And those are churches that are 20 people or less, actually, because we used to have the small church category, which was more that 50, 60, and now there's an extra category, micro churches, and about a third of our churches in our area are micro churches.
We've had in a number of denominations, all these kind of fights over sexuality, over who can be leaders, over race, and all these kind of issues. But those have all overshadowed the fact that all these churches are shrinking and are, it's like the decline of congregational life in America has been overshadowed by all these other things. So they're fighting about all these other things. And I, as a reporter who covers this stuff, I keep thinking, but all your churches are going to close, or they could close. So maybe while you're thinking about all these other issues, which are really important, you could think about this other thing. And maybe they are, and they haven't figured that out. Maybe that's just a harder thing to do, or maybe they haven't come to grips with that reality. I don't know what's going on, but it also, other conflicts have distracted people from thinking about these issues.
So one of the questions I often hear, or kind of sentiments I get, is, we just wish we could go back to the way things were in whatever period of time we're going back to, maybe the 1950s or early 60s. Did we, the people in the church, do something wrong? Like, did we take a wrong turn to get here? Is there somebody to blame for this situation that we're in, or not?
No, I would say no. I say so Laura Everett, who's the executive director of the Massachusetts Council of Churches, she has a great line for this, that you didn't do anything wrong. The job just got harder. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of this, that the world. So I often talk about, when I talk about these things, I show a picture of my granddaughter. And I say, when I was born in the 60s, right? Most Americans were white. Most Americans were Christian. Everybody going to church. And churches were like, I use the analogy of the moving walkway at an airport, right? Moving walkway at the airport was the culture was bringing people to the church. And your job when you got there was to teach them how to be the best Christian, right? So that's why you have Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutherans, because they were all different ways of being the best Christian, right? And so Lutheran's the best way of understanding this, or being Presbyterian. Well, now the moving walkway ended, so you're not getting people brought to your door. So now you got to convince people, oh wait, I have to come here. So the question they're asking is, why should I even care about being Christian? Why should I be involved in this? And so the world changed, right? And so all the other things changed, which things about sexuality and gender and family size. So when I talk to my granddaughter, I say, every who was born 2 years ago, I say the world she's born into and the world I was born into are completely different. And almost every congregation in America was built for the world I was born in. Almost none of them are built for the world she's born into and the world that it's the world changed. So it's not your fault. It's not your pastor's fault. You could have had better music. You could have, obviously, if you did before you did any dumb things in your church, everything changed. The dumb things you did could have made it worse, but that's not even if you did everything perfectly, you'd still have this problem because the world and your context changed.
Yeah, so any individual one church may be experiencing something different, right? Growth or decline or not, or just sort of status quo. But broadly speaking, things have changed so much.
Yeah.
The moving walkway has changed so much, far outside the control of any individual church, that this is just the reality that we're in.
Yeah, and if we think about, I remember reading. Do you remember the purpose-driven church, which preceded the purpose-driven life? I remember being in an urban church then, and our minister was like, and I was on church council. We're going to read this book, and it's going to tell us what to do, and had a model for doing church. And you read the first chapter, and Rick Warren talks about he went and found the fastest-growing suburb in America and put a church there. Well, no, duh. If you had put a church in the fastest growing suburb in America and it hadn't grown, then you were bad at your job. But you can't take the context out of this.
Okay, so that makes me think, like, often we measure decline against the height of church participation in the mid 20th century, right? Or we take moments like that, the purpose-driven church. It's a big booming area it'd be hard to fail at planting a church, right? But we often measure decline in that way. Should we be doing that, or should we be thinking about this moment and decline differently?
Well, that's a good question. I think we just need to understand things are different, and that nobody. So Robert Putnam talks about this in this book, Bowling Alone, right? That people don't join things anymore. That we are just in a different era. So when you think about decline, so if you actually haven't declined, or if you're staying even, you're actually doing pretty well. And you just have to think you're in a different world, I think, and say, okay, how do you best be a congregation in this world that how do you best connect with your neighbors? So you have to really think about those things. And you can't take for granted that people will come to your congregation. You can't take for granted that they'll stay, that they'll trust you. So you have to think differently. And you have to understand that, I think you have to understand that why decline happened, and not think about who's to blame, but think about how do you adapt. That's a big shift, right? If you say, oh no, I can't blame these folks, but sometimes the way I put it is, this is not your fault, it's your problem. It's the problem you have to deal with, is that this happened, and now how do we fix it?
I like that. And it's just the reality of where we are in this moment, right? Mm-hmm. So you were with us at the Gone for Good Summit. And you've watched as the narrative in the media has changed, and we've seen more and more and more stories about this property piece. I'd love to know, like, when you wrote Reorganized Religion, did you think this was coming? Or are you just like, oh, I'm so glad we're finally here in this moment talking about this? Like, yeah. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's both. It's both those things. I have been watching this for a while and thinking, why is no one paying attention to this? And then so now that people are talking about it, I'm like, great. In some ways, I think, oh, I wish I'd written it like 6 months later, because then people might have seen my book later. But there are lots of people talking about this, so I'm really happy that folks are talking about this, because it's a really crucial question. And what happens to those buildings? And it seems to me that, and this is probably the work that you do, the earlier you start thinking about things, the better. So I have just had a church that closed. So you all may know the name Ryan Burge. Ryan Burge is a political scientist who studies trends in religion. He was also an American Baptist pastor until a few weeks ago. And he was at a little church, and the church finally closed in a small town. They had already sold their building to a school that met there. So they already knew what was happening with the building. They planned this out. And then they said, well, it was a little bit like being in hospice, in that we know our time is coming together, congregation. We want to be able to name that, but also know what's going to happen, so that we can plan for the future. If we have to go to another church, what's going to happen to our building? They had resolved some things. 2 years ago, I went to the closing of a church, which I had gone to for years, and they were dear friends of ours. They didn't know what was going to happen to the building. They didn't know what was going to happen next. And I think that some of the folks there are still unsettled because of that. And the building got sold and is no longer a church, and it's something else. And so I think that has made it harder for them to not know if you're going to close your building. If you've got a plan, that might be better. Or if you're going to adapt it to another use, if you have a plan, it's better. If you wait till the building is falling over, you have no more choices.
Yeah, if you just wait too long, it just kind of happens to you rather than you shaping it at all, right? So you're a reporter with Religion News Service. You get to report on things that are going on all over the country. You get kind of an interesting view of it. Many of us are more sort of localized in our work, but in your case, you're seeing it all over. And you just shared a cautionary tale there. What are some other cautionary tales that you've seen, that you've come across as that relates to this question of the change in participation in religion, which then leads to different uses of property, right? And so, like, the property, the buildings, the land. What have you seen that's kind of not gone very well?
Oh, well, you see the buildings that fall down. There's one in Connecticut that fell down. I remember years ago in Chicago, there was a building they were trying to sell, and the roof just caved in. So the thing just closed, or it gets closed and it's empty, right? You drive by and so you hear a lot of that. In fact, I've been seeing, the things I've been covering more are folks who thought early about it, right? There's a church in St. Louis that knew they were going to close. They trained their pastors to be bivocational. They sold their building to a school. They opened a coffee house. It's not a religious coffee house, but it is like a third place in their community. And it's going really well because they thought about it ahead of time. There's some churches that are becoming YMCAs. So I see those kind of things. But I hate it. Like in our town, there's a couple churches that are just empty. That's what I go along and I go, oh, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. And what could have been there, What I think is really interesting, and that this is probably this is not cautionary tales, but maybe tales of what could happen. One of my favorite stories is a little church in Spring Hill, Tennessee. Little church. There's a dynamic startup church right down the street, meeting in the school. Little Baptist church for years. They just never get off the ground. They vote to close the church. They vote to merge with this new church, and the church had an interesting name. It's called the Conduit Church, which I always thought about electrical pipes, but they wanted to be a conduit for God in the world. Okay, I'm like, fine. This one older lady was just like, she voted no. We're not merging because I don't want to be part of this. And then after they merged, she just showed up, and the older folks, sometimes when a merger happens, young people come in, the young people just take over and the old people fade. Well, no, she was just like, I hate this, but if it happened, I'm going to go deal with it. So she starts sitting at the table with these young people. She meets these women she becomes friends with. Now, this woman her husband had been ill. She'd run her own company for years. She'd never gone on vacation. They have one of these Bible studies. And they say, well, would you rather go to the beach or the mountains for vacation? She goes, I don't know. She's like 80 years old. I've never been on vacation. I work. So they take her to the beach. And she meets all these friends. She said it because she said yes to this whole thing she didn't know was possible. And maybe that's and I think all the things that she could have missed if she said no and they hadn't merged, or she said no and I'm going to cut myself off from this. So if there's caution, like it's more like there's a whole world there that you could have that you won't have if you don't think about it.
I love that. She said yes to something. Even if she didn't like it or agree with it. Yeah.
Okay. You've mentioned a few times, if you think early, you've got to think early about it. How early would you say? How early? Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. I think you just think about it all the time now, whether it's going well or not going well, because the world has changed no matter how many people are at your church. No matter because it's not going to stay like that forever. Those kids are going to get older, and all you need is a pandemic or something to change. Like this church that closed 2 years ago, a couple things went wrong. Pandemic happens, and this church had long drawn people from a nearby college and seminary. They'd all go there. Well, then no one's on the campus. There's no new people. Then this school decides we're gonna have more remote, so people aren't gonna come back. They also got from the denominational headquarters down the street. Well, they're like, we're all remote. Well, all of a sudden your pipeline for people, which had been working for years, was gone. And then they had to think, oh, wait, we have to rethink our whole way of doing this. Now, when they closed, they still had like 65 people. So they could have kept going, but they were just exhausted by this and they didn't see a way forward. But I think I think it happens all the time. Like I go to a small congregation now that's doing pretty well, though we just had a fire. Our building burned down. We've been out of it for a while. But they're doing well because a bunch of kids, they offer confirmation and no one else in town offers confirmation. But even them going well, we should be thinking about, well, how do we keep this going? How do we sustain this? What's going to happen when these kids grow up and there aren't kids coming to confirmation class, right? Like you should be thinking about it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're with you.
With you, especially when you have choices, right? Yeah. I think the thing I learned from that conversation we had is that you can have choices early. Mm. If you wait too long, you have no choices, and then everyone is. The one thing I have found that's really interesting as well, this is probably completely off, it's related to this, is the giving of buildings to other congregations. You know, the gifting, that seems to have worked where you get a congregation that is doing well and giving in a way that is not like replacement. You don't give it and give up. You give it and say, okay, we'll join with you folks and be part of you. There's been some really interesting congregations where that happened. But again, it happened because a congregation that was, I'm wandering a little bit here. There's a really interesting church called Quest Church out in Washington, in Seattle. It's right near where Mars Hill was. And it's in some book. This is a number of years ago. But what happened in this church is an older church that was doing pretty well, but realized this other church was doing that was renting part of their building was just going gangbusters. And they decided to join that other church and give the building to them. But it only happened because the pastor of the church, they got a new pastor who got the church healthy, relationally healthy. So in some ways, and they were healthy enough to say, we could do something different. So if you're thinking about this, there's you think about the future, but you should also be thinking, how do we be the healthiest congregation possible so that we can think about this? Because if you're healthy, unhealthy, or if you're stressed out, or if you're angry, or if you're worried, you can't make good decisions. You make bad decisions because you can't think about this.
It strikes me that in our wider culture, the temperature's turned up so that actually it's people are stressed out and it's hard to have deep conversations, and it feels like there's a lot of fear. Are we going to agree? Are we going to disagree? If we disagree, can we be honest and stay in relationship about that? I mean, it feels like this is a moment that it makes it harder to have those conversations earlier.
Oh yeah, no, so if the people in your church are not a little freaked out, they're not paying attention, right? Because everything, the economy has been stressful, at least in the United States, right? The politics are stressful, the lack of institution is stressful, family life is stressful. Yeah, no, it's very hard right now. In some ways, this is where people, to go back to that moving walkway, when people were being brought to your church and they were going to show up anyway, you didn't have to work as hard on internal relationships. So they were going to show up anyway, right? You didn't have to work. Now you realize, oh, you have to be much healthier to do this. So yeah, I think the work, I almost feel like you need a couch potato to 5K for churches. If you know what that is. If you've never run, you can learn how to run a 5K in 10 weeks following this program, couch potato to 5K. Start running a little bit, you run a little bit more, all of a sudden you're running 3 miles without stopping. Well, it's the same thing. Like there needs to be a congregational health program to get people to learn all these skills that they used to have. How to run a meeting, how to talk about things, how to name what you're feeling, how to be good to each other and kind to each other.
Well, I have to say, I think, not to do a big plug here, but that's one of the things that we've tried to do in our Good Futures Accelerator is just how do we get people doing the work instead of thinking about the work, just like give them a set of questions to ask their neighbors, get them to walk around in their neighborhood and ask the question, what did they see? You know, how do we just, I think it is a capacity building moment. We need to rebuild those muscles that were part of our civic and church life together that have frayed.
Yep.
So,
and this is one other downside of the the consolidation to large churches is those large churches have often adopted a staff-driven model, which is good, right? Because you need to have but they've lost some of the congregational meeting and governing skills that you used to have. And that, a congregational meeting can be, as anyone knows, interesting experience. It's not beautiful democracy, but you have to learn, right? How do we have an orderly discussion about hard topics? How do we learn to agree to disagree and then go have coffee afterwards? How do we work through things? How do we communicate? How do we make decisions communally? And when you have a staff-driven model or an elder-driven model, and I'm not making a theological statement, but when you have a leadership model says that the leaders decide and you all follow, then the people in the congregation realize my input's not needed in where we're going. So if you tell people you don't need their input, then when you need their input, they can't give it because they don't know how to do that.
You're sort of describing a consumer kind of approach to it, right? If you're just the consumer of a service, you just show up and receive it. But then we're in a moment where people just aren't consuming that service.
Yeah.
Right? Not in the numbers that they were.
No, they weren't. Or an empowerment service to say that this is the role that we've trained you and developed you to do so that you can do this. So people also haven't been empowered or when you have a model that has, so some of the problems of clericalism is that the lay people are not seen as leaders. And so there can be a little bit of that too. You can have a consumer model, but you can also have you have the other big sort model where people only want to be around people. It's actually, let me restart. I just heard this phrase. It's the PLM problem, the people like me problem. That you only want to be around people like you, right? You want to go to church with people like you. You want to buy things from people like you. You want to hear from people like you. So then when you have to hear, if you only around people like you, then when you meet people you're not like you don't know what to do. You don't know how to hear. There's a congregation of Universalist Unitarians on Martha's Vineyard that last summer did a whole series on, it was called Belief, Barbecue, and Baseball. And it was about belonging. And I talked to the pastor. I'm like, why are you doing this? Because it's a great title. And she's like, because my people can't belong to each other. If I give them what they want, they'll stay. But if I don't give them what they want, they'll leave. And I'm like, you're Unitarian, Universalist. You must all agree. They're like, no. We also have a set of expectations of what is. So it's not just it's consumer in the way that consumer tastes are shaped. The choices must be the choices that align with me, and if they're not, then I don't want to be around you.
Can you tell us another story of some other interesting example of sort of a church use of its land or buildings in a way that is really interesting for whatever reason?
The Y churches are really interesting to me. The YMCA churches. There's one actually in Ryan Burge's town. There's a YMCA church, but in Rockford, Illinois, there's a Lutheran church. It's kind of a big, boxy Lutheran church that is now a YMCA. And what happened there was that the church had gotten older, and they got COVID, and COVID comes along. They can't keep going. But across the street, they have a school. And for years, they'd had an outreach to the school. And then they went and found the YMCA wanted to do a school outreach. And they're like, hey, we have this really nice building. And it's in pretty good shape, right? They had fixed the roof. They had an elevator. They had handicap accessible. So the building had been kept up. So they said, well, why don't you... First, they said, well, why don't you have your programs here? And then they said, would you take our building and make it into a Y? So they were like, yes. And the sanctuary, because it's big and boxy, works perfectly for a gym. The sanctuary is now the gym. And they had a chapel. Well, the chapel is now the worship area for the church. And they have a kitchen. All right, this is great. And they have a great big parking lot. So the church had long hosted this kind of community end-of-year carnival fair big outreach thing. Well, you can do it because you got a parking lot. It's a really fun thing because the folks are really excited to see the building filled with people. And they're also going to have an ongoing living, worshiping community there. But because they didn't need this, and because they kept the space up, they had this possibility they could offer. It's one of the most fun things. I'm like, first of all, I think that's going to be gym, and okay, this is having gym in the church, but also they had thought through it enough and they had assets, right? They had these assets. So the parking lot is going to be filled with people. It's just going to be different people. Near San Francisco, there's a bunch of Nazarene churches that are empty because there were a bunch of Nazarenes out there in Northern California. They're not doing very much. So one of them is now a warehouse for extra goods from manufacturers. So stoves and microwaves and building materials and all this stuff. So they basically they had several buildings they didn't know what to do with. So one of the churches they're renovating into a church that's actually a worshiping community. But they also run basically this kind of excess goods donation site. So say you're a ministry and you got and they get furniture and they get microwaves, like I said, and appliances. So say you do housing. And you got a family, like a refugee family needs housing. They need furniture. They need stove and appliances. Well, you go to this church. They go, oh, yeah, go to our warehouse. Drive up to the warehouse. You get all the stuff. And then you can go do your ministry. So they use it to empower other ministries. It's really interesting. They get all this excess goods. There's another Nazarene church there that turned their building into a co-working space, basically. Co-working space. So they have enough space for their worshiping community. But they think, we got all these other offices. Well, okay. Let's become a co-working space. So we'll rent the space, other parts of the building to other nonprofits, but we'll have our church there. The third building that's really interesting is in Houston. This is super interesting. So down in Houston, there's I just talked to them because they lost their insurance. I did a big story. So if you want to have a story, it's the worry right now is church insurance. All the big insurers are in trouble. And they're raising their rates. So like with our church, we got to do this rebuild of the building. So then I'm thinking our insurance is going to go up to the roof. So how are we going to, so probably when we get back in the building, we're going to have to pay a whole lot more just to keep the building the way it was. So this is going to this could close a whole bunch of churches. This is one that terrifies me. I'm like, oh my gosh, do you have to pay $30,000 or $50,000 every year just to keep your building open? That's a deal breaker. So after that aside, there's this really interesting church down in Houston. So this pastor, there's a little bit of a story. The pastor is at a big kind of well-off church, but wants to go start a church in Israel. He's doing mission trips in Israel and like tourist trips in Israel. He's like, I want to plant a church in Israel. So it's super interesting there. So he gets it all set, and then he can't get a visa to go to Israel. He's like, well, but he's already given up his church. And he's like, well, what do I do? Then he finds out about this little church in Houston. They're in a really great area. They got a building they'd put up, but they could never finish it. They got way too much space, but it's a little church that sort of is the kind of the church that has some moxie and could do something. So he says, I'll come be your pastor. He goes, we got all the space here. Let's just rent our space to all these other churches. They got 11 churches meeting there. And they do the back office stuff together. So like accounting and HR and stuff. But the church is like a big multicultural, multi-congregational meeting space. Because there's a lot of congregational sharing. Well, this is intentional congregation sharing on steroids. Because the building wasn't even done. It was like half finished. So they finished it out with intentional giving space to a whole bunch of folks. And then they do all this joint ministry. It's really.
That's fascinating. It's like a church food court.
Yeah, like a church food court. Yes. Or a church industrial park. Yeah, church food court is better. Yeah, no, it's great. And they're doing, now they're having to rebuild sort of a little bit after COVID, like everybody. People couldn't afford things, but they're still doing some really great stuff. But I thought this is and it's a little. The church that owns the building is like 200 people, so it's not big. The other folks that are doing great stuff is a church in Chicago that's doing all this migrant ministry. They bought they're Hispanic Reformed Church in America, so mainline church, Hispanic mainline church with some Pentecostal roots. They're like 200-300 people. They just so a little bit bigger, but not gigantic. But they bought a paint factory because it was cheap and was empty. And then they got the state to renovate it with environmental impact stuff. And then it's become a giant ministry warehouse, food and clothing. So all the folks who are migrants coming to Chicago, a lot of them end up at that place. They go there, they get food, they get job counseling, they get medical treatment. Some of them end up going to church there. Some of them end up working there. So they turned this property that they bought into this kind of this center for ministry. Because they thought, oh, well, we could do this and it's needed. And they've got a lot of partners. The other thing they do is have a lot of partners. So like that church that has the warehouse for excess goods, they found a bunch of people who they can help. They can have partnerships with, like donated goods. Well, they get the donated goods from someone else. They get the clients from someone else, and they put it all together. So it's like it's a we don't have to do this all ourselves, but we have something to bring to the table approach.
It's interesting though, because that's not the way the church has historically thought. Like, we don't have to do it all ourselves. And yet you're talking about all these new kind of partnerships that open up and different funding sources. Oh, we get, the city pays for the refurb of the building, right? And we can get different types of sponsors, and we're going to get these goods from somewhere else, and all this new possibility. But we have to look outside of what we can do on our own, right?
Yeah, they're doing, Laura Everett, again, I mentioned down in Boston, is spending a lot of time with city officials saying, you don't have to care what we do on Sunday or on Saturday. You should care what we do Monday through Friday. You should care about the homeless shelters and the pantries and the food outreach and all this stuff. And you could help fund those and partner with us to do all these other things together, because we are important constituents, not because of our sacramental work on the weekends, but everything else. Now, she believes in the other stuff too, right? She's not saying that they don't matter, but she's saying that for the community, we matter because of all these other days of the week. But again, that's a different framing of this. And it's a framing of, we want to work together with you, and you don't have to work for us. Or you shouldn't support us because you are already here and we're important. We're a good partner and a good neighbor. So can we work together?
Yeah.
I'm struck by the fact that the vast majority of your examples include a worshiping community that continues in some form or another. It might be smaller than it was historically, or it might be different than it was, but there's a lot of narrative around this conversation that sort of suggests that it's a conversation about churches closing in mass and disappearing in mass, and to some extent that will of course happen. But what you're describing is churches changing, not just it's not churches necessarily being replaced fully by something else, but becoming something else and involving something else. And so their building and land might look really different, but there's still worshiping community life going on there. And that's, I think, quite an interesting framing of it and thinking about it.
Yeah. And I think the framing of the ability to change, to still exist, or to say, is there someone else who's doing this better than we are? And could we let them do that with this asset? Like there's a way to, and gets tricky with denominations, right? There's tricky denominational polity. There's tricky denominations like who invested in this and who gets to say in this. It was easier. So the YMCA, for example, in Rockford, they're evangelical Lutheran church. So their ELCA, their policy is congregation owns the building. So they didn't have hoops they could give it to somebody else. But there are congregations that are sort of startup that are doing a good job, that have enough assets to maintain a building that could be good partners. They're just different. They look different. They have different understandings of polity, but the church could pass it on to them. It's a little different. It means a stretch, but then, oh wait, this other thing is happening that we're part of this continuing. Because everything every congregation, this is what came to me when I was writing this book, is that every religious institution in America, every congregation was built on someone else's work. Somebody else did a lot of work to invest their time and energy to build this thing and to get us here. And so how do you, in your current work, think about, who are all the people that are going to benefit from this 50, 100 years from now? Well, they might be different. So one of my favorite discoveries during this, I grew up in a church called the Evangelical Covenant Church. Small, they're a free church. They're offshoots of the Swedish Lutheran. I'm not Swedish, but they decided early on there's not a lot of future in building on the children of Swedish immigrants. So we got to. But they have a whole history of this, right? So they build a church in my hometown. Within 2 years, they realize this church is too small. So they say, we got to sell it and build a new one. Like they'd only been there 2 years. They sell it to the Jewish congregation in town, which is great, right? So this is the early 1900s where Jews and Protestants were not getting along very much at all. So no, they're like, hey, we'll sell it to the Jewish congregation. We're going to build a new building because we don't have enough space. And then they say, well, we're speaking Swedish. No one speaks Swedish. We got to speak English or you will lose your young kids. Then that building comes too small. They build another building in another part of town because they keep thinking, oh, wait, we need more space for more people, so there's room for them. And so now the church is sort of thinking they've had a bit of a lull. They're a little bit in decline. They're still thinking what do we do now? But I thought when I went to meet with them, I'm like, oh no, you did this for your whole life. So this is a little bit of field this, but if you are thinking about a different kind of denominational church that could come into your space, well, someone else had to make the space for you to get there. So maybe you could make space for someone else. That's hard and that's complicated, but if there are congregations, and in some towns it's not possible, but those assets could be something of a value.
Yeah, it's a question of stewardship and a question of legacy.
Yeah. Or the last one I love is the other story that I do love, which I would actually love to go do, but it would be probably it would probably be because I'm just selfish. There's a church, a United Methodist church in a little town outside of Dayton that a science fiction writer bought named John Scalzi, my favorite science fiction writer. But he's like in the town. He lives in a little town. It's called Bradford, Ohio. And this Methodist church closed, and he buys it. He buys it because it's a town asset. And the town asset, they had community meals there. They had concerts there. They stuff. He's like, if this thing could just get closed, and I need an office space, but also I want to invest in the community. He buys it, and now he's renovated it. It looks great, but it's like, oh, that's a fun thing, because here's somebody who's secular, who realizes the church building matters. So he's preserving this church building as a community asset, that's a whole completely different thing. So I would love to go. I've met him before. I thought, this would be great fun to go interview him at his church. That would be more because it'd be fun to do more than, but I can't really justify driving to Ohio to do it. But it is interesting, right? To say, oh wait, this building matters, this place matters. So how do I preserve it?
I think you should do that.
I do too. I do too.
I think I'm gonna try to figure out if I get to Ohio. I will. I don't think I can just go there, but if I'm happy to be drive through, I might do it.
He was actually really interested in the Gone for Good book.
Yeah,
because he had just bought that.
Yes, he just bought that building. Yeah. I saw you did this thing on his site. Yeah, no, I think that's a guy. He's an interesting person in that he recognizes that organized religion matters, even though he's not religious. Mm-hmm. So
that's cool. One thing that strikes me about you, Bob, is you are so joyful. Like, even in this moment where a lot of people are hand wringing, you just ooze joy about this moment. And you've been a religious news writer for a long time. I wonder, have your thoughts shifted on what this moment offers or why this moment matters?
Oh, it has. And so I've been doing this 25 years. And so one of the great part about this job, I get to talk to people all day long about God, and I don't have to win, which is the great part, right? So you tell me you believe in whatever. I'm not trying to convince you why that's wrong. And so then I can get a chance to hear you. So I have been really convinced that churches and religious institutions have a ton to offer right now. Like, they have all these skills for this moment. So they know how to take an moral inventory, and say, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? And if we did something wrong, we should make amends for it. And here's how you make amends. They know how to help people become better people, right? So part of being part of a church or an organized or congregation is to say, you're not so awesome. In fact, you're pretty terrible, but you're loved and you could get better. And here's how you do it. In fact, we're going to offer a whole group of, and they're also built on friendship, which is and friendship of people outside the building. And at its core is like, we're going to offer you friendship. We're going to offer you ways to become better. We're going to invest in you and let you invest in other people. These are great things, but they have the skills that really we need at this moment. Like what communities need in this moment are, what they call non-anxious presence. They need people who can think about the long term and say, we need stable relationships, because we're more connected than ever before and more separate than ever before, right? We can get everything we need delivered to us, and we can find out what's happening all around the world, but we don't know our neighbors. Well, these are place-based, intentional communities, and they are that train people how to be better human beings, kinder, gentler. And what they can say is, in a time that we're all divided, say, how about if we didn't do that? How about if we did this? There's a great new book called Living Fully by Elizabeth Oldfield. Yeah. That's just out. I was just talking to her this morning for an interview. And she has this great story in there where she gets on a bus with her daughter, and it's late in the day, and there's an older woman who gets a bus, and the older woman yells at her. Her daughter's sitting in the wrong seat, and they're going to be at each other. And then Elizabeth, she's like, okay. Then she just turns to the woman and says, "Could we have a do-over?" Because she'd just been reading about do-overs in her parenting class, and they have this lovely conversation. And then they sort of become a little bit of friends. So, wait, we could say, I don't want to do that thing. I don't want to hate you. I don't want to be this person. And there's a great line from Star Trek that says that only a fool fights in a burning house. And that's the most lovely thing. But I think one of the things that churches tell you is like, let's not be fools. Mm-hmm. If there's a crisis, let's be better people. And they train people how to be good people. And they train people also to think about others ahead of time. So I read a lot about disaster relief and all those kind of things. Well, what does organized religion do? They get people together. They tell them you're not so great. Here's how you be better. Then they send them out to the world to make a better place. Then they have your phone number. So when they have your phone number and they collect money. So when they have those things, so they can think ahead of time. We can have classes on how to help our neighbors. We can have a food pantry. We can have these kind of things because they had a chance to think about it ahead of time. So they do organized kindness of strangers, right? So people have always relied on the kindness of strangers. Well, this is the organized part of it, right? So when something goes wrong, you are not thinking, well, how do I get anyone's phone number? And how can I collect some money? Or where could we have a shelter? No, we got a building, we got money, we have a phone tree. So they're really useful, but they can make us, this is a long answer. But I really do feel like it's teed up for churches and communities to say, oh yes, we've been preparing for this our whole lives. And now we get to do it. And it's hard and it's messy, but it's not without hope. And what you see is like what you could say yes to. And often you think about, if they just said no, like that woman who ended up going on vacation with all these friends. If she said no, I don't want them in my church. Our church is going to close. Or if she said no, it's okay, we can have that. You can have our church, but you can't have me. You're not going to get my friendship. But then she gets friendship. And she gets love and a vacation and this real joy that she never thought was possible. And I think that's the magic of religious communities. Is there's these things that happen that you never expected among people you didn't know you could have loved, but you love them and they are kind to you. And they'll let you down because they're people, but doesn't mean you get to choose who you want to be and what kind of communities you want to be. And it's just lovely when it works.
Oh, Bob, you just have given me so much hope for the church in this moment, right? And it's just so nice to hear those stories. And I love thinking about that woman that did lean in where it was uncomfortable and how the church showed up for her. I don't even think we need to ask this final question, but I think we do need to wrap. So we are planning to ask everyone a final question each episode. And so I'm just going to go for it and say, as you consider the reality of the world and the witness of the church, what is your hope for the church in America today?
I hope that we just say yes to these things. They'll say, yeah, I would just like not to do stupid things. I'd like to be better. I'd like to have something different because we could say, don't waste your time. There's no time for any of this noise. And who did the stupid thing to what on TikTok and who called someone a name? Okay, people call someone, just be yourselves, be better. Because it's so much better not to be terrible, right? It's better to be a better person. And there's so much possibility. So I really do hope that folks will say yes, that they'll say, what could we do, that they'll take a minute to look at their neighbors or the other people they disagree with and just listen to them and say, okay, I hear what you're saying, that you are a person of value and we are people of value too. And could we be friends? Could we do a do-over? And maybe that'll work. And if it doesn't, then it's better than wasting our time. There's a million things we could do that are better than wasting our time yelling at each other.
Hear, hear. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us, for kicking off our season. We're just delighted. And thank you for your work and your book and just the way you're continuing to tell the stories that the world needs to hear. Thank you.
Thanks, this is fun. Now I'm feeling all emotional. Golly, I get all verklempt.